when we all get to heaven. All right, well, good evening. I'm not my Uncle Terry. He called me this afternoon. He was in the vehicle in Gastonia. I'm not sure where he was headed, but he was stuck in traffic at the time. So it's me, and I'm glad all of you are here, even Eddie, who wouldn't have come if he'd have known it was me. So it's all right. If everybody would stand, we will sing tonight 514 in the hymn book if you want that. It's When We All Get to Heaven. First, second, and last. Sing the wondrous love of Jesus. if you would, just take a few moments and welcome each other to the service.
Well, as we get started this evening, we'll take your prayer concerns, and can you lay 1 Samuel chapter 8. If you don't have a copy of the timeline for tonight, there's some at either entrance, and so be sure to have one of those as we work through tonight, through tonight's study in the timeline of the Bible. Tonight we are going to tackle the time period of the kings, or really the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. And so as we get started, the time frame that we're going to be looking at is from the year 1052 BC to 587 BC. The text, if we were to look at it and take it all into account, we would look at 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And so in those 6 books of the Bible, primarily the second part of Samuel and the Kings and the Chronicles, that's where we see about the history of the kingdoms, or the kings and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And so tonight we're going to go through looking at the United Kingdom and the divided kingdom, and then we're going to hit the timeline. So I'll explain the timeline when we get to that point. But we're going to start off by looking at the United Kingdom of Israel, because this is the first part of the timing of this part of the timeline. Because, last time we were looking at the division of, or the conquering of the land of Canaan and the time of the judges. And when the time period of the judges ends, we find ourselves with Samuel. He's judging and then transferring to being really the first of the prophets, and he's leading Israel in this way. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8, Israel they come to Samuel, and they basically asked for a king to rule over them. They were trying to keep up with the Joneses. All the other neighboring people groups had kings, and so what did they want? They wanted to be like everybody else. And so they wanted a king, and a king to rule over them. And Samuel wisely did not want them to have a king. And God told him that Israel was not rejecting Samuel as the prophet or the judge of Israel, but that Israel was rejecting God as their king. And so God said, he's basically saying, Samuel, don't worry about it. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. It's much like when we talk about someone rejecting the gospel. They're not rejecting us as a person. They're rejecting Christ. They're rejecting the gospel. And so it's that same mentality that God is sharing with Samuel here about the kingship. And so the first king to rule over Israel, we know, was King Saul. He was the son of Kish from the tribe of Benjamin. And the distinguishing factor about King Saul that we read about there in 1 Samuel chapter 9 excuse me, was that he was head and shoulders taller than everybody else. The average man in, like King David and other men in the time of King Saul would have been about 5'7", 5'8". And so to put it in perspective, I could do a really cool illustration right now by having my wife walk up here and help me out, but she won't do it, so I'm not going to do it. But Misty's about 5'7", and I am literally head and shoulders taller than her. And so that would give you the example of how tall King Saul was compared to just the average Israelite. And so quit talking, Misty. That's not nice. No, but nevertheless, that gives you an idea of the actual height difference when you think about the kings between Saul, who was on the outside looked like the greatest king ever. He was tall, handsome. They talk about how good looking he was, and he was on the outside looked like he would be a great king to lead Israel. And so that was his distinguishing features that they talk about. But really, Saul wasn't much of a king. He was the king that ruled over Israel for 42 years, from 1052 as the first king to 1010. But he wasn't much of a king. He had a few victories over enemies, but he had a whole lot more personal and moral failures than he did anything else. And so I think we got a map to show you about the size of the kingdom that Saul was leading over. You see that, here is the Dead Sea, here is the Sea of Galilee, and so like this would be the region of Galilee, down here's Jerusalem, and even down here's the area of Hebron and Beersheba. And so he controlled a large area, but the kingdom of Israel expanded from a loose confederation of tribes into this kingdom that you see here that Saul was in charge of. Because since the division of the land under Joshua, the Israelites had really been 12 separate little kingdoms in their own tribes, and they would occasionally help each other, but they'd also occasionally fight each other too. So they were good brothers, so to speak. They'd get along for a little while, and then they'd get in a fight against each other, and one thing or another, back and forth. And that's the way they worked. But under Saul, Israel became a bona fide nation, or a bona fide kingdom under his control there. And so they came together and they agreed that they wanted a king. Well, while Saul was still alive, King David, the son of Jesse, was anointed as a king by Samuel. And again, remember the story of David's anointing. Rather than King Saul, who everybody looked at and said, that has to be the man, when it came to King David, he was the one that they forgot about out in the field keeping watch over the sheep. And every son of Jesse that walked through, Samuel's thinking, that's got to be him. That's got to be him. And then it's like, do you have another one? And it's the runty one out in the field. And so again, though, as we read in Samuel, we find that it wasn't the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. And that's where we find that part of the scripture defining David more so by who he is on the inside than who he is on the outside. Although it does say that he had a ruddy complexion, that he was handsome as well. But we know that he was anointed by Samuel to be king. And after Saul died in 1010 BC, David took over ruling Israel. Now he started ruling in Hebron in Judah for 7 years, and then he ruled for 33 years in Jerusalem, and he ruled for a total of 40 years. Now, David expanded the kingdom of Israel to include large sections of the Promised Land, and then some, so to speak. But we know that everything that had been conquered under Joshua's leadership was basically controlled by David. And you see, this is at the time of David and Solomon. This is a map from an Israeli website that I found. But the thing about it is, Solomon didn't really expand the empire much, or the kingdom much. He had strategic alliances that really helped keep it peaceful during his time. We'll talk about that in a minute. But most of the dirty work to get the kingdom to where it was done by King David. And so you see the outline of modern Israel today, not counting part of Gaza and the West Bank over here. But for the most part, you see where the state of Israel is today, but also the land that was occupied by King David and ultimately by King Solomon. But David conquered lands outside of the Promised Land because, really the Promised Land to them, when Joshua and the tribes went in, the Promised Land was basically everything right here. That was basically it. That was what we term the Promised Land, for the most part. Now, granted, we've talked about, I think Alta or someone asked at one point about how much of the land did between what Abraham was promised and what the Israelites took in the conquering of Canaan would work. Well, what was really promised to Abraham was everything up to here and back down. I mean, it was a larger section than even David conquered. And so David conquered a lot of what had been promised to Abraham, but he still fell short of including all of the land that had been promised there. But he conquered lands outside of the Promised Land and ended up started getting tribute sent to him from people like, he had a partnership or an alliance with the king of Tyre, which is right there, which was outside of his control. But he had an alliance with them. They sent lumber for the king's palace and even eventually for the temple. But roughly about a year before David died, we know that from what we read in the scriptures that he ended up placing his son Solomon in charge of Israel, and he ruled for about a year, give or take. We don't know exactly how long. before David died. But we know that his reign started in 971 BC and lasted for about 40 years to 931 BC. Now, where David had to conquer all of that land and expand the empire or the kingdom and really work hard, and David had, he couldn't build the temple because he had a lot of blood on his hands so we know that Solomon basically reaped the rewards of that. He reaped the benefits of his father's hard work. He was basically handed, a turnkey kingdom, and all he had to do was basically rule over it. And all he had to do was make strategic alliances, which he did. And Solomon ruled over a relatively probably one of the most peaceful times in Israel's history. He also ruled over one of the most prosperous times of Israel's history because, there was regular tribute that was sent to him from all over, even from, like the Queen of Sheba and others were sending him things all the time. He had this, we read, I can't remember, I didn't write it down where, that he was receiving 666 talents of gold annually as tribute from other places. So I got on Google, did the research, figured out the numbers and one thing and another. He's basically getting, in today's dollars, 1.6 billion with a B dollars worth of gold annually sent to him. And so he had a lot of gold that was being sent to him, and that doesn't include the silver and other things that would be given to him as tribute. And so the interesting thing is you get from Saul to David to Solomon, and you would think, well, they've set up this massive kingdom. It's on cruise control. It's good to go. And Solomon's son Rehoboam is the one who is next in line to rule Israel. And unfortunately, after Solomon, it goes from the united kingdom of Israel to the divided kingdoms of Judah and Israel. Because almost immediately after Rehoboam takes over as king of Israel, there's a split in the kingdom. Jeroboam starts to lead part of the kingdom. And so after 121 years of united monarchy in Israel, the kingdom splits, and they split into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And so Israel, the northern one, had 10 tribes in it. I'm going to rattle them off for you, but if you want to take notes, the easiest way is to write down the 2 that are in Judah, in the kingdom of Judah, and then figure out from Scripture who the other ones are. But the ones in the northern tribes were Asher, Dan, Ephraim, Gad, Issachar, Manasseh, Naphtali, Reuben, Simeon, and Zebulun. That's a whole lot of names to try and write down out of the 12 tribes. Well, Judah, the southern kingdom, consisted of Judah and Benjamin. And so those were the 2 tribes that were in the southern kingdom. And so the 2 kingdoms went on vastly, wildly different trajectories in their history with the kings that were leading them. Because the northern kingdom of Israel fell into idolatry basically from the get-go. And so they fell into idolatry and remained in idolatry for the 208 years of their history as a kingdom. And the kings and queens of Israel, they were just wicked and evil kings and queens, as we read about in the books of Kings and the books of the Chronicles. And so they had kings and queens like Jeroboam, Manasseh. Manasseh, he ruled for like 50-some years. I think it's in your Manasseh was 50. Nope, I put the wrong name in the wrong list. Manasseh was in Judah, but they had Ahab and Jezebel. I mean, they had some Jeroboam and Jeroboam II were just wicked kings, and they were just sinful, and it was a bad time to live in northern Israel, I guess you would say. But nevertheless, in 723 BC, the Assyrian king Shalmaneser V conquered Israel, and then he exported or transported most of the Jews, not all of them. They left some in the area of Israel, but not many. They took most of the Jews to other areas of the Assyrian Empire and just sort of, spread them out, dispersed them in those ways. Then the Assyrians imported people from across there, different people groups from across the Assyrian Empire into Israel, and this gives rise to the Samaritans. Because Samaria was the region in which Israel was the northern kingdom of Israel was basically in, and Samaria was the capital of, the city of Samaria was the capital of Israel, or the northern kingdom of Israel. And so when these Assyrians are imported into Samaria and into northern Israel, this gives rise to the Samaritans, which to the Jews who considered themselves to be pure-blooded Jews, so to speak, and that the northern tribes were now diluted in their bloodline, that they were Samaritans, they were less than a Jew, they weren't, to them they were basically a Gentile. And so, and not just a Gentile, but they were basically, the Jews looked at them as the worst of the Gentiles. And so this gives rise to the Samaritan-Jew dynamic that it plays out so much in the New Testament in the days of Jesus. And so it's pretty remarkable to see that this is how that comes about. But the kingdom of Israel, that northern kingdom, only lasted 208 years. Now, the southern kingdom of Judah was not much better than Israel at times. They had many kings and queens that were wicked and sinful, but there were glimmers of hope at times in Judah. Because there were godly kings who God used to bring about revival in Judah and bring them back to himself. And Judah existed for 344 years. And so Judah had kings like Asa and Joaz, Uzziah, Hezekiah, and Josiah. Those were kings that were godly kings, but they had other kings that were not, like Manasseh. He was evidently out of the kings of Israel, and Judah, he was probably one of the most wicked that there was. And of course, he's the one that rules for like 54 years. And so, unfortunately, they had kings like that and queens like Athaliah, and that were just wicked people. But there were at least glimmers of hope in Judah. They never had that in Israel, up in northern Israel. And so, in 587 BC, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, as we read about in the book of Daniel and in Jeremiah and other books of the prophets, Nebuchadnezzar comes in and he conquers not only Judah, but he destroys Jerusalem, he destroys the temple, and carts off into exile for 70 years many of the Jews, again leaving just some of the poor in the area to tend to some stuff. But for the most part, we see that the Jews are pulled out. And interestingly, this wasn't in 587 BC. That wasn't just like Nebuchadnezzar shows up in town and he just goes wholesale attacking Jerusalem. If you look on your handout, we're going to take a few minutes to look at the handout now. If you'll take your handout and instead of looking at it that way, read it from the top with Saul at the top down to the bottom. If you look down at the very bottom, in 605 BC, this was the first attack by Nebuchadnezzar. So there was 18 years of attacks on, or over the course of 18 years, Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem and Judah 3 times. In 605 BC, that is when Daniel would have been taken captive into exile in Babylon. In 598, the prophet Ezekiel would have been taken into captivity. And then 587 is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And so what I wanted to point out to you is at the very top of your handout, you'll see that there are the 3 kings of the united kingdom of Israel. You've got Saul, David, and Solomon, the years that they reigned and how long they reigned and how long they lived. Now, below that, after Solomon, it splits between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And they both go on their different trajectories as far as the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And so you see that there's sometimes where there were kings that competed. If you see that there's sort of a stair step, look at about halfway down on the longer side on the kingdom of Judah. When you get to like Amaziah, who ruled for 29 years, and then you see Uzziah ruled for 51 years, and Jotham ruled for 15 years. When Amaziah had been ruling for 6 years, he brought in Uzziah, and they ruled as co-regents. They were co-kings over Judah. And then after a while, obviously Amaziah dies. Uzziah rules for a little bit by himself, but then he brings in Jotham as a co-regent, a co-king with him. The only one that was a little different, you even see that over in the kings of Israel. The only one that was a little different was about the third one down with Omri and Tibni. They actually were ruling at the same time and competing against each other. They weren't working together, but they actually competed against each other. But you see the different places where they were co-regents and how they ruled together there, and you even see the year 723 when Assyria takes the northern tribes into captivity and disperses them, and then you see 587 with Zedekiah being the last king of Israel at that point. And so it's, we see there that, and I tried my best to mark the different kings. I saw this on a different timeline where they listed all the bad kings in red because they were state fans, and all the good but they had marked all the bad kings with red and the good kings in blue. And so I wanted to do the same thing because it would make it easy to distinguish between which kings and queens potentially were good or evil. Now here is the thing. When we read in the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles, the books of Kings and the books of Chronicles, it is hard. When you're reading down through there, they're talking about a king in Judah, then they're talking about a king in Israel, right next, and it's hard to keep them all straight. At least now you have a resource here that if you keep that in your Bible, when you're reading through the Kings or the Chronicles, you can start to look. When you find that name of that person, you can see what is happening around them and who their co-regent was, if that was the case. And so outside of the information about the kings, the only other thing that we have out there is the fact that Samuel lived until about 4 years before Saul died, and that's how long he was prophesying until about 1014, which would have been about 4 years before King David took over. And so you've got a lot of information there, but it's one of those, we've been reading our timelines that direction. It's a whole lot easier to read it that direction for the most part. And so that's got a lot of information about the kings and their positions and what happens in the line as who's ruling when and across the border, so to speak, from each other. Now, as we always do, we're going to talk for a few moments about the key players during this time and the who of this time part of the timeline. And the first one is obviously going to be King Saul. And Saul wasn't, as I said, much of a king, but the more I thought about Saul and him becoming the first king of Israel, I thought about him being the older sibling that the parents are sort of trying out being parents on. You know what I mean? Because when that first kid comes along, you're like, I have no clue what's going on. I'm going to try my best with them, and hopefully they'll turn out okay. Any first children in the audience tonight? I know there's two. My wife's not going to raise her hand, but nevertheless, sometimes as parents you feel like that's the case. Well, I think that Saul gets a bad rap for not being a good king at times because he did have some really bad character flaws in one thing and another. But the reality of it is he was trying to figure out for Israel what it meant to be king, what it looked like to be king, what had to be going on because he was king. And so he was the trial and error for the people of the kingdom of Israel to really figure out what was going on. And unfortunately, he did not lead Israel well. He wouldn't fight Goliath, so what does he do? Have at it, David. He wouldn't fight Goliath. He offered burnt offerings that he was not supposed to offer. He wasn't allowed to offer at that. He tried to kill David repeatedly, and that was partly because of jealousy, partly because of this evil spirit in him. But also, he didn't kill the king of the Amalekites, King Agag, or the livestock of the Amalekites, and because of that, God removed the kingship or the dynasty of the kings from Saul's family and took it away from him. And so we know from the scriptures that Saul and his sons, Jonathan and others, were killed in battle against the Philistines in 1010 BC. And interestingly, this is the only account in the scriptures of cremation. Because the men of Jabesh, they go and they bring Saul's body back off of the wall of a nearby Philistine town. They cremate him and his sons, and then they bury his bones under a tamarisk tree in Jabesh. And then David later has his bones removed and taken to his father's tomb in a place called Zelah. And so we know that that's a rather inglorious end for the first king of Israel, but that is the result of what happened to him. Now, David is the next who, and he's obviously going to be on our list to discuss tonight because he is considered the greatest king of Israel for a reason. I mean, he didn't just get that handed to him because, they liked the way he played the harp. It wasn't just that. It was a matter of the fact that he led the kingdom politically and militarily. He led them like no king did before. Now, granted, he only had Saul to work with, or any king after him. Nobody has led Israel the same way that David did. He conquered ground for Israel. He expanded the kingdom's footprint, and he also made key alliances that would benefit Israel and would benefit them for really upwards of almost 75 years, if you want to think about it that way. Now, despite all that he did well, we know that David famously and spectacularly had failures morally. We know about his adultery with Bathsheba and his killing of Uriah, and we also know that he almost lost his kingdom altogether to his son Absalom. And so, David ruled until, as I said, about a year before his death, and then Solomon was allowed to take over ruling the kingdom. But David died at the age of 70 and was buried in Jerusalem. And the grave or the tomb of the kings, you can actually go, if you're ever in Israel, I looked it up online, you can go and visit the tomb where David is buried, and it's free admission. So if you can afford to fly to Israel and it's safe in Israel to go, you don't have to pay anything to go see King David's tomb. But nevertheless, he was buried there in Jerusalem. And Solomon is going to be our third who that we're going to talk about tonight. But Solomon, he was considered the wisest king ever, the wisest man to ever have lived, and arguably probably one of the richest men to ever live. I saw an accounting of his net worth, if you want to call it that, and it was in the trillions, was the number that was thrown out. I don't remember how many it was, because it's kind of like you get past, a trillion, and it's like, does it really matter whether it's one or whether it's 100? It was over $1 trillion, and so his net worth was ridiculously high. So he was obviously not only the wisest king ever, or the wisest person ever, but he was arguably probably the richest king and the richest man of all time. But behind his father David, Solomon was probably the greatest king that Israel had. Probably the second greatest king, I guess you would say, because Solomon didn't have to lead Israel into battle. He didn't have to do those sort of things because of all the work that his father had done to conquer ground and then set up these strategic alliances and start receiving tribute. And so all of this worked to the benefit. Well, Solomon takes over, and what does he do? He maintains the kingdom at basically its borders where it's at, but then he makes even more strategic alliances. The only problem is his strategic alliances was by marrying non-Jewish women, the daughter of Pharaoh and others that were not Jewish, and they would eventually pull him away from the God of Israel, and it would be a long time for him before he sort of sees the error of his ways, and we start reading some of that in some of his writings. But Solomon had a peaceful reign, but that peace came at a price, because he had, as we read in the scriptures, he had any and every worldly pleasure at his disposal, and he fell away from God and following God because of these foreign wives that he had married that were pulling him away from God. And this time of luxury and this time of peace probably also led to Israel's divided kingdom after him, since Rehoboam would have grown up in this environment and thought he basically had everything on cruise control and wouldn't have to try for anything, wouldn't have to work for anything, and had no idea about the work that his grandfather David had put into building the kingdom. And, you know, we even read where Rehoboam takes over and the people are like, hey, your father Solomon's been hard on us. Let's cut back on the expectations and on the taxes and those sort of things. And Rehoboam seeks the counsel of Solomon's court and then his own friends. And Solomon's court is like, yeah, you know, his advisors are like, yeah, you probably need to, you know, rein it in a little bit, you know, back it down a little bit. And Rehoboam's buddies are like, show him what you're made of, bud. And what does he do? He goes in there and he says, you know what, if you think Dad was hard on you, wait till you see what I'm going to do. And that's when the kingdom splits. And so it probably come about from this sense of entitlement that Rehoboam probably had, that he thought he could do whatever he wanted and it wouldn't affect the kingdom, but ultimately it split it. Now Solomon, we know he died at about the age of 69 and after ruling for 40 years, and was buried in the same tomb as his father David and many of their royal descendants. And so when you go and see the tomb of the kings in Jerusalem, because you found cheap airfare and you get free admission, you can see more than David, you get to see Solomon's tomb as well. And other kings, not just those two, there's more there. But nevertheless, we get to see who the who is in the time of the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. And so I always share with you too some of the events in world history going on during the time of King David and the kings. And so the first one is this: in the 900 BC area, shortly, really during David and Solomon's reign, more so probably David's reign, the Greek city of Sparta was founded. And so that was founded around the same time that it was the late 1900s or the late 900s. And so that's when David would have most likely been ruling over Israel. In 840 BC, the Gopala dynasty started in Nepal, and that was the first dynasty to ever rule in Nepal. There must have been something in the air during this time where people were starting to say, hey, we want kings to rule over us, and this particular dynasty would have been happening around the time of Jehoram in Judah and Joram in Israel. But then you've got in 716 BC, Roman legend marks this as the date that Romulus ended his rule in Rome. That goes back to the Roman legend of Romulus and Remus being raised by wolves and being the ones that Romulus being the one they named Rome after. For those that are Star Trek fans, this has nothing to do with outer space. Or not that Romulus. But nevertheless, so 716 BC, this would have been sometime around the Hezekiah's reign that this would have happened. And then you've got in 668 BC, Nineveh, capital of Assyria, becomes the largest city of the world, taking the lead from Thebes in Egypt. I looked it up. This is about 100 years after Jonah would have went to Nineveh. And you remember how large Nineveh was supposed to be in the days of Jonah, that it took days to go across it. Imagine how big it's grown in 100 years after that. And so it becomes the largest city in the world during that time. So 668 BC would be Manasseh, during Manasseh's reign. Then you have May 28th, 585 BC. That's a pretty specific date. But there was a solar eclipse predicted by a man named Thales, which was a Greek philosopher, scientist, while a Greek king, whatever that guy's name is, Elatus, is battling Cyaxares, one of the Medes and Persian kings. Now, you may be like, okay, Pastor Nick, what does May 28th, 585 BC mean for anything? The thing about that is, this guy correctly predicted that there would be a solar eclipse based on the movement of the moon and the sun and all of that. And the key thing there for world history is that from there forward, they're able to date, and even going backward, it's a fixed point in history that they know what day that happened, because they can look back at the way the eclipses occurred, and they know exactly what day that was, and that helps them to date other things moving forward towards the time of Christ, or even moving backwards towards the time of David. But 585 BC would have been 2 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. And so Jeremiah was probably in Egypt by that point. And so that would have been some of the world history events going on. But as we always close out, we want to look at the timing of God's story, especially in regards to the line of promise, as we've been looking at, and how God's story of redeeming mankind works out through that line of promise, through the timeline. And now last time we looked at, during the time of the judges, how despite the sinfulness of Israel, God is able to continue the line of promise. During the time of the judges, God didn't just put the line of promise on hold and be like, okay, when you guys get your act together and we get you a king, then we'll start it back up. God continued it despite their sinfulness. But this time what we see is how God was able to align the royal line of Israel with the line of promise. Because I mentioned it earlier, and I don't know if anybody caught it, but what tribe did King Saul come from? Benjamin, correctly. So the thing is Benjamin the royal line of Israel? No. What tribe does the royal line come out of? Out of Judah. And we've talked about that before. And so the key here is that because the Israelites wanted a king, they wanted to be like all the rest of the kingdoms around them. And so God gave them exactly what they wanted. They wanted a tall, good-looking king to rule over them, and that's exactly what they got. And so God gave them what they wanted, basically a king from a well-respected and valiant, courageous family in Benjamin. But had the royal line of Israel continued through the house of Saul, we don't know how the line of promise would have been affected or how God would have maintained it. But here's the key. Here's the key thing. God knew all along what would happen with Saul, and know that they wanted a Saul when they really needed a David. And so God knew through his omniscience that Saul was going to mess up to the point that he would lose his the dynasty, or the opportunity for a dynasty. And so God knew that he would ultimately sin against him and disobey him. And so, although it seems like God's plan for the line of promise sort of took a detour because of Saul, or during the reign of Saul, it was actually giving time for King David to be prepared to rule. Because when the kings started with Saul, David wasn't even born yet. And so it wasn't even an option for the greatest king in Israel to start ruling and for the family line to continue until David came along. And so through David and Solomon and Rehoboam and 18 other kings, all before the exile anyway, the line of promise continued just as it had from Adam to Abraham, and from Abraham to Judah, and from Judah all the way to David. And so now the line of promise was no longer in obscurity. You know, last time we talked about how Amminadab was the one that was born 2 years into the wilderness wandering, and how he would have been the one that the line of promise was maintained through the wilderness, sort of in obscurity. Well, now, rather than being in obscurity, the line of promise is in and going through the most important person in the nation, or in the kingdom of Israel, and that would be through the king, starting with David. And so now they were at the forefront. Now, this alignment of the royal line and the line of promise, the key for us is that sets up the Messiah to be a very unique individual. And the reason for that is the Messiah would physically be from the line of David, Israel's greatest king, but he would also be spiritually be the Son of God and be the King of Kings. And so this Messiah is set up for this very unique position. And so for the next 580 years after the destruction of the kingdom of Judah and the destruction of Jerusalem, what we see is that the line of promise would go from being the forefront, most important person in the kingdom, back to the background, back to this, fading into the background of Israel's history. Because think about it. From the destruction of Jerusalem, you have the exile, then you have the return, and then you have the intertestamental period between the end of Malachi and the first of Matthew. And so what we see is that the line of promise after Nebuchadnezzar ransacks Jerusalem and destroys the temple, the line of promise goes to the background again for almost 580 years until about 6 BC, when there is a little baby boy born in Bethlehem, also known as the city of David. And so we see how this is setting up things to continue with this line of promise. And so that is tonight's study. Are there any questions that I might have an answer to? Yes, sir. Could Solomon speak to animals? I don't know. I don't know, isn't it? Is that, I mean, it's not like he's Aquaman or nothing. I mean, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, he could speak to animals, but I don't know that they're going to listen to him. That's a good observation. Any other questions about non-superpowers from the scriptures? Any other questions about tonight? I would love to be a fly on the wall in your house, not just because of the girls, but because of Dean. Any other questions? Those were good ones, David. Yeah. Yeah, it is. They wanted what they wanted, and what, think about it, because, in 1 Solomon 8 and 9, or 1 Samuel 8 and 9, what God says is that they have rejected me as their king. And, now what they're wanting is, rather than a spiritual king, they're wanting a worldly king, and that's exactly what they got in King Saul. They wanted a worldly king, just like all the other worldly kings around them. And so what do you get? You get a worldly king. Yeah, and that, I don't know that God is vindictive like that, but He's like, okay, if that's what you want, it's one of those cases where they wanted something, and God said, okay, have at it. You can have what you want, but you're going to see that it ends poorly for you. Yeah, learn the hard way for sure. Any other questions or? Yeah, that's a good observation. If you didn't hear Patsy, she said that it was almost as if Saul was set up for failure, because he wasn't chosen by God. He was chosen by the people. I mean, chosen, in that regard. And so, and that's right. That is God chose David instead, and that's a good observation. Any others? Any other thoughts? Yeah, if you didn't hear what Keith was saying, he was basically saying that the leaders that are put in place, regardless of where it is, whether who votes or decides or whatever, God is you didn't say this, but God is sovereign over whoever is in positions of leadership. I got into a discussion. I wouldn't say an argument, but I got into a discussion years ago with someone over a matter of faith, and I made the comment. I said, well, God's sovereign over whoever is in a position of leadership. I said, God is in charge of it because God is sovereign over everything, whether that's, who's in charge of, the town council or the presidency or a king or a whatever. And they looked at me and said, so you're saying that God let Hitler kill 6 million Jews? I said, well, I mean, God is sovereign, so He allowed him to be in position because, and I sort of turned it backwards and I said, so are you saying that God wasn't in charge, that God wasn't sovereign over that or any other situation? And they kind of got quiet at that point, didn't really say much more about it, because I think they realized the error of their ways in their thinking that God wouldn't have been sovereign and God wouldn't have been basically God at that point. But yes, whether it was Manasseh, who was as wicked a king as they were, or whether it was Josiah, who was as good a king as Israel had had outside of David, or whether it was David or Saul, God is sovereign over who was put into those positions of leadership, whether it's modern day politics or 2,000 or 3,000 years ago and somebody being king over Israel. So, any other questions? No other questions? All right. Well, next week is Father's Day. Next Sunday is, and so we won't have an evening service next Sunday for Father's Day, but we will, the following Sunday, we'll pick up with this exact same time period in history, but we'll be looking at the prophets in Israel and Judah rather than the kings. And so once we get past that, we'll move into the time of the exile. And so I hope that you'll be here on Wednesday night. I've been asked by more people today than I think I have any other time we've had a typo in the bulletin. But I'm teaching Wednesday night. Tammy just forgot to take Terry's name out. And so sometimes it was like, is Terry really teaching again? But other times it was like, is Terry teaching again? And so I don't know whether to be, concerned about it or happy about it or what. But we'll be starting into Philemon, and we'll be looking at our introduction of that particular book of the Bible on Wednesday night. Next Sunday morning, we'll be back into our series on the gospel in the Gospels in Mark, and we'll be looking at a woman that was healed. And so that's sort of where we're headed in the next couple of days. Remember, if you have a youth going to the Cool Summer Nights, get the address for the house, and we'll give it to you, and drop them off about 6 o'clock, and we'll probably be done about 8 o'clock. And so we'll have a pool party and play cornhole and have a good time. So I'm a glutton for punishment, going to Caswell with the youth for a week, and then me and Misty having them to the house, just a couple days later. But I will tell you this: I did hear the youth discussing about how great a time they had at Caswell earlier today, and they were talking about it, and they were so excited that Larry had gone with them. Now, that may sound counterintuitive to some of you, and it does to me at times, but we had one particular youth. Now, he's young and naive and impressionable, but this particular youth is convinced that Larry has superpowers. You talk about, I don't think that he thinks he can speak to animals, but he said, we were walking out of Hatch, which Hatch is the big sanctuary, and we were walking across the parade ground, which is just basically a big open area, a big open field. And our house that we were staying in was just across the field there. And so he was like so dead serious, and I'm not outing this youth this time, but he said, we were walking out of Hatch, and Larry was behind us. And so, we kept walking for a little bit, and he said, I was going to turn around and see, where's Larry at? How far behind is he? Is he stopped because he wasn't talking with them anymore? He said, I turned around, and Larry wasn't there. I turned around, and Larry teleported in front of us. And I was like, I don't think Larry has the power of teleportation. And they said, maybe he just floated above us and got over there. And he's convinced, Larry, that you've got superpowers. And so I didn't break his heart or bring him to reality, but you did a number on him this week if he's thinking you got superpowers. Yeah, he was a legend in his own mind and in the minds of the youth by the end of the week. Instead of Scary Larry, he was Legend Larry. So, but we did have a great time at Caswell, and the youth were they had a really good time. And I think I was telling the deacons this morning. I'll close with this. When we were at Caswell, our youth are not typically very, outgoing with, their emotions or their, or activity and stuff like that during worship. But the thing about it was, even though none of them stood up and said, I want to be saved, which, I think for the most part, most all of them are saved from conversations we've had. The thing that got me was that they were paying attention during the service. They had an exceptional speaker this week, one of the best I've ever heard. But they had a great speaker this week. But they were taking notes, and when we discussed in our small group or in our church group devotions about things they had learned in large group or during the worship service, they were making the connections and pointing it out. Now, all of the material is geared, like one day was about anxieties and worries. And so from the morning when they started to the night when we ended, it all, flowed together. But they were making the connections, and they loved the object lessons that the guy did in front of them, and it drove home the points for them. And so even though our kids were not, didn't make any commitments or decisions that would have been on the screen today about ministry or anything like that, you would be very impressed with our youth and how deeply they think and how deeply they we're connecting just at Caswell. I see it when we have Sunday school. Hannah can speak to it about Wednesday nights, and Lee's getting a dose of it right now in Sunday night. But our youth they may be quiet for the most part when it comes to speaking up about spiritual things as far as in the context of the whole church. But they were making connections mentally and spiritually while they were at Caswell. It was impressive to watch, because I've not had that opportunity for several years to be able to be the one teaching and watching them in that regard, because typically student pastors have been doing that. But it was impressive. So you ought to be if you have a youth, be very proud of them and encourage them. And if you don't have a youth, be proud of our youth and encourage them. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll close out with a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed. So let's pray. Father, we do thank you that we can come together and study your word and look at how you have worked with this line of promise to bring about the Messiah to not only be in the line of promise, but be a part of that royal line coming from King David. Father, help us as we continue to move forward from here, not only in our study, but also in our other Bible studies and our messages. Father, help us to use those opportunities to grow closer to you and to connect with you. And Father, help us as a church to support our youth and to help them as they are in a difficult time in life, just as teenagers, with all the temptations and all the worries and anxieties that come upon them. Father, help us as a body of believers to come around them and to support them and to encourage them. And we thank you for all of this. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.